Let's start with a new chapter. Chapter 10, Making Salts. This chapter looks at some of the practical problems in making pure samples of salts in the lab. Remember that a salt is what is formed when the hydrogen in an acid is replaced by a metal. For example, sulfates come from sulfuric acids, chlorides from hydrochloric acid, and nitrates from nitric acid. So in this chapter, we'll talk about some of the problems we encounter while making salts. Let's start with soluble and insoluble salts, meaning the salts that are able to dissolve and the salts that cannot dissolve. So, the importance of knowing whether a salt is soluble or insoluble in water. We'll see that some salts dissolve in water and others do not. So let's start on page 81. We'll see an example on calcium carbonate reacting with dilute hydrochloric acid, and another example on calcium carbonate not reacting with dilute sulfuric acid. Here, calcium carbonate reacts with hydrochloric acid, however, it doesn't react with sulfuric acid. Also, we'll see the reaction between calcium carbonate and sulfuric acid. This reaction is not happening since this layer is stopping the reaction. We'll talk about all these points in the first video. So soluble and insoluble salts, page 81. So let's start with chapter 10, Making Salts. In this chapter, we'll see some of the ways in which we can make salts through equations and reactions. So we have two types of salts. We have the soluble and insoluble salts. Recall that when carbonates react with acid, they produce a salt. For example, calcium carbonate plus hydrochloric acid reacts to give calcium chloride, which is the salt, plus carbon dioxide plus water. So when the carbonate reacts with an acid, it will produce a salt, which is the calcium chloride. Notice in this figure right here, we have calcium carbonate reacting with dilute hydrochloric acid. We put the hydrochloric acid on the calcium carbonate. Notice the salt produced at the bottom. The salt is the calcium chloride. So this type of salt is soluble. Let's take another example. In this figure we have calcium carbonate not reacting with dilute sulfuric acid. So this time we put sulfuric acid on calcium carbonate, but no reaction occurred. The problem is in calcium sulfate, which is the salt produced. The salt is insoluble in water. Look here. We have an original calcium carbonate. When we place it in sulfuric acid, we will obtain this layer of insoluble calcium sulfate. So a layer of calcium sulfate will surround calcium carbonate, inhibiting the reaction since calcium sulfate is insoluble. It doesn't dissolve in water. The acid particles can't get at the calcium carbonate since it is surrounded by a layer of insoluble calcium sulfate. So now we know the difference between soluble salt and insoluble salt. Calcium chloride is an example of a soluble salt. However, calcium sulfate is insoluble.